The silence came first. That was what the Vthric communication logs noted afterward, in the dry language of incident reports and debrief transcripts. Not the weapon's discharge. Not the convoy's last automated distress beacon. Not the diplomatic fallout that followed in waves so severe that 3 separate interstellar council chambers had to be evacuated when delegates began exhibiting what xenopsychologists later classified as acute existential shock. No, what every analyst kept returning to, what kept appearing in footnotes and marginal annotations long after the formal inquiries concluded, was the silence from Earth that preceded everything else. 14 hours of it. The kind of silence that, in hindsight, should have been treated as a warning. Ambassador Sira Voss heard about the convoy attack the same way most humans in deep space, diplomatic postings, heard about things that changed their lives. Through a junior aide who knocked too quietly and spoke too carefully, whose voice carried the particular controlled flatness that people use when they are trying to prevent a terrible thing from spreading outward from their throat into the air of a room where it might never be taken back. She was sitting in the observation bay of Diplomatic Station Kulith 4, which occupied a gravitationally neutral zone between Vthric space and the outer rim of the Tessel corridor, and she was doing something deeply unglamorous for Earth's highest-ranked diplomatic representative in the outer cluster. She was eating noodles from a thermal container and reading a 2-week-old message from her daughter, who had started kindergarten and wanted to know if the aliens had any pets. The aide, a young man named Davy Akafer, said her name once and then waited. She looked up. His face told her before his words did. The convoy had been designated EC-7 under the Emergency Resupply Protocol. 11 unarmed transport vessels carrying medical equipment, water reclamation components, and enough caloric protein concentrate to sustain approximately 40,000 displaced civilians on Kethara Station for 3 years. The civilians were Vthric. The convoy was human. The arrangement had taken 9 months of negotiation to finalize and had been heralded by both sides as proof that the post-corridor tensions were finally, carefully, beginning to dissolve. The Vthric enforcement fleet opened fire on it 43 minutes into the corridor transit. They destroyed 7 of the 11 ships before the remaining 4 managed emergency folds back toward human-registered space. 112 human crew members died in the first pass. 39 more died in the scramble to fold out. The surviving ships limped into sensor range of Relay Station Orin 2, broadcasting automated emergency codes, and carrying 104 survivors, 61 of whom had injuries classified by medical response teams as catastrophic. The Vthric enforcement commander, a senior tactical officer named Vas Orath, filed a report within the hour stating that the convoy had failed to respond to hailing protocols and had therefore been classified as an unauthorized incursion under the Corridor Defense Statutes of 2219. His report was thorough, procedurally correct, and written in the tone of someone who had done exactly what they were supposed to do and expected commendation for their efficiency. He did not appear to understand what he had done. That was the first thing that should have alarmed someone. It didn't, not yet. Sira set down her noodles. She did not speak for a long moment. Davy stood in the doorway watching her the way people watch something they aren't sure is stable. "Pull the comm logs," she said finally. "All of them. The convoy's transponder data, their hailing records, everything from the enforcement fleet as well. I want the raw data, not the summary." Davy hesitated. "Ambassador, the Vthric Liaison Office has already requested a formal." "The logs," she said. "Then get me Earth." She did not say it with anger. She said it the way someone says something when the anger has already moved somewhere deeper and quieter inside them, somewhere it will be more useful later. It took 6 hours for Earth's response to arrive, because the relay chain through the corridor's outer boundary added significant transmission delay, and because, Sira would learn this later, there was a second silence that preceded the official response. A silence in certain offices and certain councils that no one would fully explain, but that several people in the aftermath would describe, carefully and with visible discomfort, as a period of decision. She spent those 6 hours reading comm logs. What she found made her put the thermal container of noodles in the disposal unit and not eat again for 31 hours, though she would not fully understand why until much later, and neither, for a long time would anyone else. The convoy's hailing systems had been functioning. Every single one. The transponder data confirmed it. EC-7 had been broadcasting its identity, its diplomatic designation, and its authorized transit codes continuously from the moment it entered the corridor. The Vithric enforcement fleet had received those transmissions. The comm logs showed reception confirmation at 17 separate intervals. Vas Orath's fleet had known exactly what it was firing on. Sira sat with that knowledge in the observation bay with the stars hanging outside the window like punctuation in a sentence she couldn't yet finish, and she waited for Earth. When Earth's official response came, it was not what she expected. It was not what anyone expected. It was not, she realized as she read it 3 times, what it appeared to be. Earth's response was a single document, 17 pages, addressed to the Vithric Diplomatic Council, the Tessel Corridor Authority, the Interstellar Claims Assembly, and every registered diplomatic observer in the outer cluster. It was written in measured, precise language. It expressed formally that humanity recognized the loss of the EC-7 convoy. It documented the deaths. It attached, without editorial comment, the complete comm logs showing the enforcement fleet's reception confirmations. And then it did something that made every alien diplomat who read it fall very quiet. It requested a comprehensive, independently verified accounting of every piece of cargo destroyed with EC-7. Not compensation, not reparations, not even an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. An inventory. Every species that had been following the crisis expected escalation. They had models for this. The Vithric Conflict Matrix, the Tessel Tension Index, 17 other formalized frameworks for predicting how a military incident of this magnitude would develop. Every single model expected an aggressive diplomatic posture, military mobilization signals, or at minimum, a formal declaration of hostile intent. Nobody's model predicted a request for a cargo manifest. Vas Orath, when shown the document by a clearly bewildered aide, reportedly stared at it for almost a minute and then said something that would later be translated imperfectly as, "They are accounting for what was lost." He said it as a confirmation of something straightforward. He did not understand why his aide was frightened. That was the second thing that should have alarmed someone. Sira's authorization came through the same transmission, buried at the end in a brief addendum. She was to remain at Culith 4. She was to maintain all existing diplomatic channels. She was to continue her function as though nothing had changed, while acknowledging that everything had. The addendum was signed by the Secretary of Diplomatic Operations and contained a phrase that she read 4 times before she put the document down. Proceed with standard protocols. Inventory must be complete. She went to find Davy. He was in the comm room with their 3rd staff member, a systems analyst named Preeti Anand who had been seconded to the station 6 months ago and whose specialty was pattern recognition in complex diplomatic datasets. Preeti had a look on her face that Sira had never seen there before. "Tell me," Sira said. Preeti pulled up a data visualization on the room's central display. It was a network map of recent communications, not just the official diplomatic channels but the signal traffic flagged by Culith 4's passive monitoring array across the wider cluster. "Something's moving," Preeti said. "Not military, not diplomatic, I can't classify it, but it started about 2 hours after Earth's response went out and it's been expanding since." "What kind of signal traffic?" "Commercial registration updates," Preeti said. "Cargo manifests. Shipping route alterations. Insurance claim filings. About 60 different categories of what looks like completely routine economic communication, except it's all moving in the same direction and it all started at the same time." Sira stared at the display. "What direction?" Preeti pointed. "Away from Vithric space." The silence that followed was the 3rd kind, the kind where a room full of intelligent people realizes simultaneously that they are looking at something they don't yet understand. "How much traffic?" Sira asked. "It's still coming in," Preeti said. "But so far," she pulled up the aggregate figure, "about 40% of all registered human commercial activity in the outer cluster." The Vithric response to Earth's cargo inventory request was efficient, as Vithric institutional responses tended to be. Within 36 hours, they had compiled and transmitted a comprehensive accounting of the EC-7 cargo. It was accurate, detailed, and delivered with a formal diplomatic note that expressed, without quite apologizing, that the incident had been a regrettable consequence of corridor security protocols, and that the Vithric Council was prepared to discuss appropriate remediation. The Council appeared to believe this was a reasonable starting point for negotiation. 3 days later, they noticed that human ships had stopped coming. Not dramatically, not all at once. The absence didn't announce itself. It accumulated, the way the absence of something always does, in small increments that each seemed individually explicable, until you looked at the pattern and felt the floor shift beneath you. A cargo run that didn't show up on schedule, a resupply vessel that rerouted, a diplomatic courier that went silent and then reappeared, according to its transponder on the other side of the corridor boundary. The Vithric Trade Authority logged each instance with mild notation and waited for the next vessel. The next vessel didn't come either. At the 14-day mark, the Vithric Council formally noted that human commercial traffic through the corridor had decreased by approximately 63%. They filed a query with the Culith 4 diplomatic station. Sira received it and filed a response within the hour, in full compliance with her mandate to maintain existing protocols. The response said, "Please be advised that human commercial operations are currently undergoing a comprehensive logistical review. We appreciate your patience and look forward to ongoing dialogue regarding the normalization of corridor transit relations." When the translated version of this reached the Vithric Council's Foreign Relations Office, a senior official named Vas Atha, no relation to the enforcement commander, though the subsequent confusion about this would occupy 3 separate footnotes in the inquiry reports, spent 40 minutes trying to determine what a logistical review entailed in the context of interstellar commercial law. She couldn't find a precedent. She filed a notation to that effect and moved on, because the Vithric system was extraordinarily good at processing information within existing categories and somewhat less equipped for information that didn't fit any of them. The commercial withdrawal continued. At 30 days, human traffic through the corridor was down 89%. The cargo runs that kept Cathara station's displaced civilian population supplied had ceased entirely. The Vithric emergency relief apparatus, which had been intended to serve as a temporary supplement to human-supplied goods, suddenly had to serve as the primary system. It was not designed to do this. The strain showed up first in the protein concentrate supply chains, then in the water reclamation component backlog, and then, quietly and with increasing urgency, in a series of internal memos from the Cathara Station administration that described the situation with a precision that alarmed every senior official who read them. The Vithric Council convened an emergency session. The emergency session was, by all accounts, a thorough and professionally conducted exercise in the application of existing diplomatic frameworks to a situation that existing diplomatic frameworks had not anticipated. Multiple delegates noted that humanity had not declared any hostile intent, had not violated any treaty, had not issued any ultimatums. Humanity had simply, quietly, and with a completeness that felt in retrospect like it must have been planned long before the EC-7 convoy ever entered the corridor, stopped being economically present. One delegate asked, with genuine confusion in her voice, what kind of civilization responds to a military attack by doing accounting? Nobody had an answer. Sira was called back to Culith 4's main briefing room for a secure transmission from Earth at day 32. She sat alone in the room, the connection type beamed with encoding that even Preeti couldn't monitor without authorization, and she listened to the Under-Secretary of Diplomatic Operations speak for 11 minutes. When the transmission ended, she sat in the empty room for another 6 minutes before she went to find her team. "Tell me what you know about the concept of economic topology," she said to Preeti. Preeti, who knew better by this point than to be surprised by any question Sira asked, pulled up a reference frame on her tablet. "It's a model from human complexity economics," she said. "It describes the way an economy's shape, the patterns of connection and dependency, can be as important as its size. A small economy with the right shape can exert pressure on a much larger economy if the connection points are placed correctly. And if the small economy removes itself from the shape." Preeti was quiet for a moment, The larger economy doesn't lose the quantity of trade, she said slowly. It loses the structure. The shape collapses. Dependencies that were invisible because they were always functioning suddenly become visible because they've stopped functioning. She looked up. How long have we been doing this? Longer than the EC7 incident, Sierra said, and watched Preeti's face change. Because that was what the Vithric Council, in all its efficiency and thoroughness, had failed to understand when they reviewed the cargo manifest that Earth had so carefully requested. They had looked at the destroyed goods and calculated replacement cost. They had looked at the suspended trade and calculated economic loss. They had not looked at the shape, because the shape had never needed looking at before. Humans had been moving through the outer cluster for 23 years. In that time, they had built something that didn't look like infrastructure and wasn't recorded in any treaty as infrastructure, and had never been described as infrastructure by any human representative in any formal diplomatic context. They had built relationships, supply chains that existed because a human ship showed up on the same day every 8 days, and the people receiving it had stopped thinking about what would happen if it didn't. Technical specifications that a Vithric engineer had quietly received from a human counterpart, and that now underpinned a critical component of Cathara Station's atmospheric processing system. Medical protocols that had been adapted, with permission, from human emergency medicine practices, and that 3 Vithric facilities now depended on without entirely knowing they depended on them. None of it was in any treaty. None of it was formally registered. All of it had been built by people who were just doing their jobs, because humans, when they move through a space long enough, build things. They build relationships and dependencies and informal systems, and they do it the way they breathe, without thinking about it as a strategic act, because for them it isn't a strategic act, it is just what living in proximity to other people means. When Earth requested the inventory of the EC7 cargo, it wasn't beginning a negotiation. It was completing an accounting. It already knew the number. It had always known the number. It was making sure the Vithric Council would know it too, would have it in their own records, signed and verified, so that when the full extent of what had been lost became visible, there would be no ambiguity about what the loss meant. The dread was not a weapon. It was a mirror. Vas Orath was recalled from his command post on day 38. The Vithric Council was careful not to frame this as a disciplinary action in its communications, but the manner in which it happened, quickly, quietly, without announcement, suggested an institutional awareness that something had gone badly wrong in a way that didn't map cleanly onto any of their existing categories for mistakes. Sierra received notification of his recall through a routine diplomatic channel, and forwarded it to Earth with a single line of personal annotation that she hadn't planned to write but found herself writing anyway. They still don't know why they're afraid. The response from Earth, when it came, was not from the Undersecretary. It was from someone she'd worked with once, briefly, 8 years ago, during a different kind of crisis in a different part of the cluster. A woman named Charani Mwangi who had been, at that time, a logistics coordinator and was now apparently something else, something that didn't have a clean title in the organizational chart. The message was 3 sentences. The inventory is complete. We've confirmed the shape. Tell them we'd like to talk about rebuilding it. Sierra read those 3 sentences and felt, for the first time since Davy had knocked on her door and used his careful voice, something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite fear, but occupied the space between them like a held breath. Because she understood now what the 14 hours of silence had meant. Not shock, not deliberation, not the grinding of diplomatic machinery. Earth had gone silent because it had already decided, and the silence had been the sound of a civilization shifting its weight onto a different kind of foundation. The kind you build when you are very patient and very old at suffering, and you know, with the bone-deep certainty of a species that has been fighting its own worst nature since before it had language for what that meant, that the most effective response to violence is not always a louder violence. Sometimes it is a quiet and total demonstration of what you are providing. The talks began on day 41. The Vithric delegation arrived at Kulith 4 with a formality that felt, to Sierra, like armor. There were 9 of them. They were led by a senior council member named Vas Kyril, who had a long formal record and the manner of someone who had conducted several hundred difficult negotiations and believed he understood how they worked. He shook Sierra's hand in the human style, which the Vithric diplomatic corps had been practicing since early contact, and he said with practiced ease that he was grateful for the opportunity to address this regrettable situation. Sierra said, "Please come in. We have a lot to discuss." She had Preeti in the room. She did not have anyone from Earth present, which was itself a choice that Vas Kyril noted with visible puzzlement. A negotiation of this weight, conducted by a single ambassador and her analysis staff, with no military presence and no senior council representation. It was irregular. It was, in his framework, almost dismissive. He had not yet recalibrated his framework. Sierra laid the inventory on the table. Not metaphorically, she had it printed and bound, physical document in both Vithric and Standard, because humans had an old, irrational attachment to the weight of paper that she had never entirely lost. The inventory was 437 pages long. "I'd like to go through this with you," she said. Vas Kyril looked at the document and then at her. "Ambassador, I understand the value of the lost cargo, and the Council is prepared to discuss." "Not the cargo value," Sierra said. "The cargo." She opened the document to the first page. 12,000 units of water reclamation membrane, Series 7 Cascade, manufactured in the human facility at Orbital Platform Serene 9. These membranes were developed in 2218 in response to a contamination event on Cathara Station that killed 400 civilians. The development process involved 31 months of collaborative research between human engineers and Vithric Life Sciences staff. The production method includes 17 proprietary process steps that are, under current treaty, human intellectual property. The membranes currently installed in Cathara Station's primary reclamation system are Series 6. They require replacement within approximately 8 months. Without Series 7 membranes, the alternative is a full system rebuild using different technology. We've estimated that process at 31 months and a mortality rate among Cathara's civilian population that I am not, frankly, comfortable stating out loud in a diplomatic context. Silence. "Page 2, Sierra said. "It took 4 days. 4 days of Sierra methodically, page by page, item by item, walking the Vithric delegation through what had been on EC7. Not the cost, not the replacement value, the function, the history. The way each component fit into a system that had grown around it over 23 years of human presence in the cluster. The Vithric delegation had been prepared for negotiation. They had position statements and fallback positions, and a carefully tiered system of concessions designed to reach a satisfactory resolution while preserving institutional dignity. None of their preparation had been for this. By day 3, Vas Kyril had stopped taking notes in the formal diplomatic style and had started writing in the margins of his personal copy in what Preeti, watching him, recognized as the Vithric equivalent of private notation. Informal, urgent, the handwriting of someone trying to catch up with their own understanding. By day 4, 2 junior delegates had requested brief recesses that were technically medical breaks, but that corresponded with striking precision to moments when Sierra turned a page and began a new section. On the morning of the 5th day, Vas Kyril arrived at the table early. Sierra was already there, with 2 cups of a hot liquid she preferred and one for him that she placed across the table without comment. He looked at it for a moment. "You knew," he said, "before the convoy. You knew what the shape was." "We knew what we'd built," she said. "We didn't always know how much it mattered. Sometimes you find that out afterward." "Then why did you keep building it, if it created a vulnerability?" "Because it needed to be built," she said. "Those membranes kept people alive. The water systems worked. Children grew up drinking clean water on Cathara Station because we built something together. The vulnerability was a side effect of the usefulness. We don't usually stop doing useful things because they might make us vulnerable." Vas Kyril sat with that. His species, Sierra had read in the xenopsychological briefings, processed grief differently than humans, more slowly in some ways, but with a depth that once established was apparently permanent. She was watching him arrive at something he would carry for the rest of his life. "Vas Oreth believed he was following protocol," he said finally. "I know," she said. "He would not have. He did not understand." Vas Kyril stopped. started again. Our protocols classify unauthorized incursion by transit signature and response time to hailing. The convoy had the right transit signature. The response time was not within protocol parameters because, he stopped again, because the hailing systems use a frequency allocation that was updated in a 2221 treaty amendment, Sierra said quietly. The convoy's communication arrays were running on the pre-amendment allocation, a 7-month equipment lag from procurement to installation. We flagged it for update. It was on the schedule. The room was very still. He fired on them, Vaskyril said, because they didn't answer a question asked in a language they were never told had changed. Yes, she said. He put his hands flat on the table, and Earth knew this. Earth found it in the comm logs, she said, within the first day. And you said nothing. You made no statement. You didn't. He looked at the 437-page inventory, and she watched him understand it, the whole of it, for the first time. You went quiet, he said. We went quiet, she confirmed. Because an explanation would have given us something to argue with, he said. A statement of human error would have given us a framework, a procedural resolution, something to process and categorize and close. But silence with a cargo manifest. He looked at the document again. You made us look at what we destroyed. You needed to see it, she said. He was silent for almost 2 minutes. In the corridor outside, she could hear Davy moving around because Davy always moved when he was anxious and had never quite learned to stop. What does Earth want? Vaskyril asked. Sierra thought about Charani Mwanga's 3-sentence message, about the 41 days of silence, about 151 human crew members who had died on 11 ships that were broadcasting their identity correctly in a language the receiving fleet had stopped speaking. She thought about her daughter's message about aliens and pets, which she still hadn't answered. She thought about the shape of 23 years of people doing useful things together without thinking about what it would mean to stop. To rebuild it, she said, all of it, better this time with the right frequency allocation. Vaskyril looked at her. That's all. That's not a small thing, she said. He picked up the cup she'd placed in front of him. He didn't drink from it. She suspected he wasn't sure what it was, but he held it in both hands the way humans sometimes hold things they need to think about. There will be more negotiations, he said. There are protocols. The Council will require certain formal steps, certain acknowledgments of, we know, Sierra said. We have time. Something shifted in his expression at that. Something that looked across the vast interpretive gap between species like a particular kind of discomfort, the discomfort of someone who has just understood that the person across the table has a different relationship with time than they expected, a longer one. You were very patient, he said, and it wasn't a compliment exactly, it was an observation, the way you might observe something geological, something that had been forming for much longer than you were aware of. We've had practice, she said. That evening, Sierra sat in the observation bay with the stars outside and her daughter's message open on her tablet. She read it again. She started composing a response and stopped 3 times before she wrote anything worth keeping. The final message was brief. She told her daughter that yes, some of the aliens had things like pets, small companion creatures that they kept close and cared for carefully, and that the relationship between them and those creatures said interesting things about what they valued and feared, about which kinds of living things they found comfort in. She said that the galaxy was full of different kinds of minds, and that most of them were trying in their own particular ways to not be afraid. She almost said something else. She almost tried to explain why she was tired in the specific way she was tired, which had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the 151 people who had not made it back through the corridor fold. She didn't write that part. Her daughter was 5. But she saved it in a file she'd started keeping since her first posting, a document she'd never intended to keep, but had somehow never closed. It was full of things she hadn't said to people who were too young or too far away or too fragile for the specific weight of them. She titled the file, years ago, with a single word. The word was later. The formal treaty amendments took 9 months. The frequency allocation update was completed within 3. The first resupply convoy under the new protocols arrived at Cathara Station on a morning when the atmospheric processors were running at 61% capacity, and the water reclamation system had 7 weeks of membrane integrity remaining. 104 crew members, 11 ships, all of them broadcasting on the correct frequency. The V-3 dock workers who received them moved with a speed that the human crew later described as, in their words, a little intense, which humans say when they recognize desperation in another being and are trying to be kind about it. The Series 7 membranes were installed over 4 days. On the 5th day, Kethara Station's reclamation system registered full operational capacity for the first time in 14 months. A technician in the processing bay, a V-3 woman who had been running diagnostics every 6 hours for the past 3 weeks, saw the readings change and stood very still in front of her console for a moment before logging the status update with hands that, according to the station record, were not quite steady. Sierra received a copy of the operational report automatically because she was still on the diplomatic distribution list, and she read it in the Culith 4 comm room with Preeti and Davy on either side of her. None of them said anything. Davy made tea. He made it without asking, which was not a thing he had done 6 months ago, and which meant something about how the last months had changed the kind of people they were becoming. 3 weeks later, Sierra received a communique from the Interstellar Claims Assembly. It was a request for information, a formal inquiry from the Assembly's Xenological Affairs Division, asking Earth to provide historical data on human commercial presence in the outer cluster, specifically the formation of informal dependencies and logistical interdependencies not captured in formal treaty frameworks. The inquiry had been prompted, the document explained, by the fact that 6 other civilizations had independently contacted the Assembly in the past month with variations of the same question. They had been reviewing their own supply chains and interdependency structures in light of the EC7 incident and its aftermath, and they had all discovered, to varying degrees of alarm, the same thing. Humans were woven into their economies in ways nobody had written down. In ways that, upon examination, nobody was quite sure how to remove. In ways that had been built not through policy or strategy, but through 23 years of ships arriving on schedule and people exchanging specifications, and a species that built relationships as a reflex, as a fundamental metabolic function, as something that happened when humans were simply left to be themselves in proximity to others for long enough. Preeti, when she read the communique, let out a long breath that she'd apparently been holding for some time. "They're scared," she said. "Yes," Sierra said. "Of us?" Sierra considered the question carefully. "Of not understanding us," she said, "which isn't the same thing, but it produces similar results." Davy set down 3 cups of tea and looked at the communique over Sierra's shoulder. "What do we tell them?" Sierra thought about 14 hours of silence. She thought about 437 pages of inventory. She thought about a woman in a processing bay whose hands weren't steady and a file called later, and her daughter, who was 6 now, who wanted to know if the aliens had any pets. "We tell them the truth," she said, "that we weren't planning anything, that this is just what we do, that we show up and we build things and we stay." She paused. "And we tell them that if they want to understand the shape better, we're happy to walk through it with them." Page by page, she picked up her tea. "It's a long document," she said, "but we have time." Outside, the stars were doing what stars do, burning at temperatures and scales that made every political crisis in every inhabited system look like a brief illuminated footnote in something much older. And somewhere in the deep registry logs of the Tessel Corridor Authority, a notation was quietly added to the official record of the EC7 incident. It was not a dramatic notation. It did not use elevated language. It was filed by a junior records administrator who was simply doing their job, in the format required, under the classification system that existed. But whoever read it would eventually reach the conclusion field, which in the Corridor Authority's database had a controlled vocabulary, a drop-down selection of pre-approved categorizations for incident outcomes. There were 47 options. The administrator had reviewed all 47, and none of them fit with sufficient precision, so they had done what junior administrators occasionally do when the system fails to provide an adequate container for something real. They had used the free text field, which existed for exactly this situation, and which almost no one ever used because the system usually had the right box. The free text field said, "Incident resolved." Note, the human response to hostile action in this case does not correspond to any existing category in this database. A request has been filed for a new classification. No existing framework for predicting human behavior under provocation appears to have remained accurate through the duration of this incident. Further study recommended. The request for a new classification was pending. The study had already begun. And in 43 civilizations across the outer cluster and beyond, in the quiet computational hours between formal governmental functions, analysts and administrators and xenological researchers were doing the same thing, pulling their trade records, their supply chain histories, their informal exchange logs, and finding again and again, in the fine grain of 20 years of daily commerce, the same quiet pattern, the same unhurried accumulation, the same fingerprints of a species that had moved through their space like weather, not because anyone planned for weather, but because weather doesn't wait for permission. It arrives, it shapes the landscape, and then you learn, too late to have prepared differently, that you had built your entire civilization on the assumption that it would keep coming. That was what the silence had meant. Not shock, not grief, not deliberation. Earth had gone silent for 14 hours because it was remembering everything it had ever built in every corner of the outer cluster, counting the shapes, measuring the dependencies, understanding, with the particular crystalline clarity that humans seem to achieve only in the moments directly after catastrophic loss, exactly what it had and exactly what it was willing to let be seen. The Vithric enforcement fleet had fired on an unarmed convoy carrying water membranes and protein concentrate and medical equipment for 40,000 displaced civilians. Earth had responded by making the galaxy look at what it depended on. And the galaxy, one careful civilization at a time, was still looking. Not because Earth had demanded it, not because any treaty required it, but because once you understood what the shape was, once you saw how deeply and quietly and without ceremony a species had threaded itself through the living systems of 43 worlds, you found that you could not stop looking, the way you cannot stop reading a letter that says something you have always suspected was true and have never, until this moment, been able to prove. They were not the strongest species in the cluster. They had no singular technology that rewrote the rules of war. They had no ancient advantage, no evolutionary gift, no predetermined outcome bending the arc of history toward their survival. They had ships that showed up, people who asked questions and remembered the answers, a species-wide compulsion to make themselves useful to whatever was nearby and to keep making themselves useful steadily, without drama, across decades and distances and treaty amendments and wars that weren't theirs, because usefulness was not, for humans, a strategy. It was a reflex. And when you fire on a reflex, you discover, too late, always too late, that you have not eliminated it. You have only made it visible.